might not look like it today because it's cloudy and it's about to rain, which I absolutely love, but it's spring, which is a great time for adding plants to your collection or starting a plant collection. But some of you guys might be reluctant because you might have killed a plant by overwatering or underwatering. And so today I'm making recommendations based on your watering habits. Hello, my name is Balisa. Welcome to Plants and Things, where I talk about plants and things. So before I make the plant recommendations, I do want to say a thing or two about the terms that I'll be using. And the first term is underwater. And this is typically a person who is not watering their plant enough. They are letting it dry out too much between waterings. And there are some plants, which are known as plants that thrive on neglect, that don't mind this. But even those plants need to be watered. So you cannot get away with not watering your plants for 2 months and hope that it will somehow live. Second term I'll be using is an overwaterer. And this is a person who loves their plant too much. They are typically watering it too often. So the general recommendation, and I say that with the side note that plants are different, but the general recommendation is that you let the soil dry out between waterings, and the overwaterer does not do this. And this is where I used to live, though right now I'm an erratic waterer, and that is the type of person who is sometimes overwatering their plants and sometimes underwatering their plants and sometimes watering their plants enough. And some plants can handle the erratic behavior. Some plants can handle being overwatered but hate being underwatered, and some plants love being underwatered but hate being overwatered, and some plants just want stability, and that's why they be dying. And so I'm going to make recommendations based on all of this. I'm going to start with the underwaterers, and the first plant I recommend for underwaterers is a marble queen pothos. This is my marble queen pothos, which has been featured on this channel more than once. The plant is currently bare stemmed because I decided to fiddle with it in the winter, but it is coming back up again and is going to grow all the more gorgeous this spring. This plant is honestly fuss free and is often left dry, to my shame. Despite all of that, this plant does not have a single crisping leaf, and by that I mean that the tips aren't crisping, which is what typically happens when your plants start getting dry. They first dry out at the tips and then the dryness moves inward. And so if that is what's happening to your plant, it's probably not getting enough water. But back to my marble queen pothos. As I mentioned before, and will probably mention again, this plant is fuss free. It's one which honestly could suit even overwaterers, I'm sure, but for the sake of this video and having meticulous lists with 4 plants each, I'm placing this plant on the underwatering list. And also, being the erratic waterer that I am, I have underwatered this plant more than I have overwatered it, so it has been thoroughly tested in that regard. So if you are an underwaterer, consider getting this plant. But I do want to stress again that the plant still needs water and it will die if left unwatered. The second plant I recommend for underwaterers is a golden pothos. The golden pothos is quite similar to the marble queen pothos, which is honestly why they are kept together. But I will say that the two plants have different sources. The golden pothos source is extremely shallow and holds very little water, and so basically this plant is probably receiving much less water than the marble queen pothos. I basically water them at the same time when they are extremely dry, and when I water them, I try to leave water in the saucer, but as I mentioned, the golden pothos receives much less water because its saucer is much smaller. Still, she's alive and thriving, and as I mentioned with the marble queen pothos, this plant has no crisping ends and the leaves look really healthy and golden. I want to say again that these leaves look like candy, and I want to question myself on how many times I have said this before and how many times am I going to say this again. Anyway, it just looks incredibly beautiful in the sunlight. It's a high recommendation for underwaterers. I think this plant is probably on all the lists: beginner friendly, underwater friendly, overwater friendly, etc. So highly recommend, but again, you will still need to water this plant. The third plant I recommend for underwaterers is a Rhaphidophora tetrasperma, also known as a mini monstera. This is my Rhaphidophora tetrasperma, and this is a plant that is easy to take care of once you figure out the plant's needs, which is honestly something that can be said of all plants everywhere, but I specifically mentioned it here because it took me a while to figure out the care of this plant. I used to water it. I have it sit in water, as I do with a lot of my plants, because it cuts down on the plant care time, or at least that's what I think. But after I propagated this Rhaphidophora tetrasperma, which is extremely difficult, I read up on it, and the people are not lying. They are so difficult to propagate. But after successfully completing this task, I watered the baby plant and let it sit in water, and it withered almost overnight. And I was so over plants at that point. I was just sick and tired of this particular plant, so I just let it die. And that is how I learned that this plant hates being overwatered. So this is very dissimilar to the pothos that I mentioned, the golden and the marble, which can be overwatered and can be underwatered. This plant hates being overwatered. So it is specifically only for underwaterers. So now I wait for the plant to become completely dry before watering it thoroughly, and it's thriving. So completely recommend for the underwaterers. But as I said again, you will still need to water the plant. Fourth and last plant that I recommend for underwaterers, which is actually not just a plant, is like a plant collection, are succulents. And that makes sense because, they grow in the desert. Next up, I'm going to be doing the overwaterers, which, as I said, is where I used to live. First up on the list of plants that I recommend for overwaterers is the Plectranthus verticillatus, which is my absolute favoriteest plant. And this plant, much like all the other plants on this list, doesn't mind sitting in water. This is my Plectranthus verticillatus, which I have mentioned to you guys is my absolute favorite plant. Now, this plant and I have had some ups and downs, but one thing that has never changed is how easy this plant is to take care of, how easy it is to grow, how easy it is to propagate. Much like the pothos that I mentioned in the underwatering list, this plant has been underwatered and it's been overwatered, and it has survived all these conditions, but it definitely enjoys being overwatered more than it enjoys being underwatered, because when you underwater it, the leaves just get droopy and sad. It just looks really sad. But when you overwater it, it just keeps chugging. So this plant really loves water. It loves water so much that I think it actually can be a recommendation for underwaterers if you grow it in water, which is easy then to water because you just water when the water like all evaporates. So yeah, loves water. I honestly do not think you could give it too much water. So a definite recommendation. Second on the list of plants that I recommend for overwaterers is a Monstera deliciosa. This is my Monstera deliciosa, which you guys have seen so often on this channel, and I feel like more often now, recently, I don't know why, but anyway, you're also going to see a whole lot more of it because it is just so gorgeous, and I definitely think it deserves its name as like a classic plant that everyone should have, because it's incredibly easy to take care of if you are an overwaterer. The problem for underwaterers is that this plant, if it's left too dry for too long and too often, the edges of the leaves will start crisping up. And this happened to my plant. As you can see with the older leaves, they have crispy edges because I was leaving it too dry too often, and it's the erratic waterer in me, honestly. But we have moved past that phase because you can see that the newer leaves aren't crisping at the edges, because now I honestly water it regularly, and I also make sure to leave water in the saucer. So this plant is very well watered and it loves it. And if I'm also being honest, when I'm watering plants and I'm done watering plants and I still have a bit of water left that needs to be thrown out, this plant is where I throw that water into. So this plant is getting more water than it needs and it loves it. So this is a definite recommendation for people who overwater their plants. Third on my list of plants that I recommend for overwaterers is a Bonnie spider plant. And I actually want to extend that list and say normal spider plant, even though I haven't had it. I think they probably have the same care tips, and so I think you could get away with having that plant and overwatering it. And if not, I'm sorry. This is my Bonnie spider plant, which is such a delight. The curls are so cool. And as I mentioned, I've never had a normal spider plant because I saw this plant on these YouTube streets and thought it was so cool. And then I randomly found it at a hardware store at a super affordable price and decided to bring it home. And it was so tiny and a cute little planter, and it's grown a lot since then. But before it did all this growing, it was super difficult to figure out because I put it in the sun and it would the leaves would dry out and die off, and I'd be constantly plucking leaves out of the plant. And at first I thought that the problem was that the plant was getting too much sun because it lived in a direct sunlight place. So I moved it to the bathroom, and moving it to the bathroom also helped me to water the plant often so that it was moist all the time, plus the humidity in the bathroom as well. But it grew too big for the spot where it was in, so I decided to return it to the sunny part. And did we not go back to the crisping? Like, that's where it's at now, where it's crisping. And the reason is because I'm not on top of watering it. This plant wants to be moist all the time, and it is very difficult to keep plants moist, especially when they are in the direct sunlight of the hot African sun. Yeah, and I feel like it's a fight that I've kind of given up on, because the plant is still growing well despite the crisping leaf ends, but it's definitely not recommended for underwaterers, but it would be a great plant for overwaterers. Fourth and final on my list of plants that I recommend for overwaterers is a peace lily. This is my peace lily, and it is not looking well, and it is completely my fault, but it's trying to come back. It loves sitting in water, which I guess is the main thing that I'm trying to communicate, which it makes it a great plant for overwaterers. Yeah, but it's also a plant that will honestly let you know when it's dry, so it's good for underwaterers too. For erratic waterers, which is where I live right now, I'm going to recommend the hardiest plants, starting with the syngonium generally, and the elbow and the mottled syngoniums, and actually the white butterfly specifically. This plant is honestly so hardy, and I'm not even exaggerating. I think it probably goes dry for a while. And this is because the plant is so big and the planter that is in is so small. It needs to be repotted ASAP because it gets dry super quickly, because there are lots and lots of roots in there. I say that, but I actually haven't bothered to check the roots, but I am assuming that there are lots of roots in there. But anyway, I pass by and then I find it dry, and then I water it, and then I let it sit in water, but the water goes by very quickly. So yeah, it's a plant that I need to repot quite soon, despite the dryness and the then having being wet. This plant has been keeping so well. It has no crisping leaves. The leaves aren't falling off in a dramatic fashion at all. It is hardy and chugging along, and this is my mottled syngonium, or at least it's one of my million mottled syngoniums. And every time I'm recording a video, I feel I need to say that, because I literally have 1,000,001 mottled syngoniums. Because this plant propagates super easy. In fact, even while it's growing, its roots just come out so dramatically that I think this is actually a plant that could be potted up in soil immediately. But all of that is a digression, really. This plant grows quite differently based on where it's grown. When it's closer to the sun, its variegation is more vibrant, and when it's further away from the sun, the variegation is less vibrant. But all that being said, this plant is super easy with regards to watering. If you don't mind the variegation story and you just love this plant, because even when the variegation isn't super popping, it's still quite beautiful. So if you don't mind that, this plant is super easy to take care of with regards to watering. I have left these plants dry for long periods of time, and that's because there are millions of them, but they just sit there. And then also when I put water, they sit in there and they continue to grow, and they grow really well, and the leaves size up quite quickly. So this is a really great plant. I actually don't know why I just said syngonium butterfly only, because in this pot is both a white butterfly and a neon, and they're basically getting the exact same care because they live in the same pot. Both of these plants are super easy to take care of. One thing that I actually haven't really done with these plants is propagate, and that's because the nodes are so close together. So that is something that I still need to try, but otherwise this plant grows super easy. Or really, these plants grow super easy, and they have the same problem as the elbow, which is that this plant is really huge and the plant is really small, and somebody needs to repot these plants into a bigger planter. So this plant dries out quite quickly, and it's drying out more quickly, and then I see that it's dry, and then I water it and I let it sit in water, and it probably doesn't sit in water for a long time because the saucer is shallow as well. But yeah, handles both pretty well. It's a champ. Both of them are a champ. Why do I keep referring to the one plant? What is this favoritism? Anyway, another recommendation for the erratic waterers. Second on this list is a philodendron neon. This is my philodendron neon, which is doing super well. I think neon leaves just give a different uniqueness to plants, and I really love the color. This plant is growing like a weed in a good way. The reason this plant gets such harsh conditions is because it sits on a floating shelf, and to water it, I have to get on a step and water it, which happens much less often than it should. And so this plant is left dry a wee bit too long. And then when I dry it, I do my classic thing where I overwater it and make sure that the saucer is filled with water. And this plant has a very deep saucer, and then it sits in the water. And then I honestly do water it every time if I happen to check. And that's a good operative word. If I happen to check and the saucer is dry, then I will water it. But it's the step part that I'm not getting correct. Anyway, I fill it up, and this plant is still thriving and growing really, really well and looking super cute. I'm gonna have to decide whether I'm extra propagating it or putting back in soon. So highly recommend. Third on this list, I'm gonna put the Peperomia Hope. This is my Peperomia Hope, which is a succulent type plant, and the reason why I'm including it in this list is because despite being a succulent type plant, which means that it generally handles being underwatered really well, it's also a plant that handles being overwatered really well, which makes it great for underwaterers, overwaterers, and really the erratic waterers. So highly recommend. Fourth and final is the Pilea peperomoides, also known as the Chinese money plant, and this plant grows super well in the summer. But in the winters, it is incorrigible. So do with that as you will. That is it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this video was super helpful to you. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I will see you next time. Bye.